Maureen Puddy's case came to my notice through radio 3AW in Melbourne. I don't listen to radio very often if I can help it. But on this occasion, some member rang me and said that there had been a lady speaking on the radio for about 3/4 of an hour at that stage, who'd had a close encounter with a UFO. And I spoke to Maureen, and I actually spoke to her for about an hour on the telephone, and I was intrigued by her report. And she promised to come and tell us about it at our general meeting, which she did. We had a full house there, which really surprised her, and the people overflowed out into the foyer. And she started out by saying that, although I'd say at the moment here, these encounters occurred in 1972, but were never written up in our publication until 1983, Review. And Maureen addressed one of our quarterly meetings in 1995 and was attentively accepted, to say the least. It has been said by some researchers who've never even met her that her case was an abduction. But to Paul Norman and myself, who investigated this one rather thoroughly, it was certainly not an abduction, because we were there on the whole of the occasions, especially the third one. Her story began when her son was injured at school when a chest of drawers in the library fell on him and broke his hip. And he'd been taken to the hospital by the Royal Helicopter Angel of Mercy ambulance. And Maureen had just become the president of this service. And while driving home after visiting her son in the hospital, on the 5th of July 1972, she called at her mother's home for a cup of tea and a bit of a chat. And she left there about 9:15 p.m, taking the shortcut along the Mooraduc home from Frankston. And that's the south side of Melbourne. I don't know how many of you know that area. It's quite an open area. It's sort of semi-country. And while driving home, on this occasion, she saw a blue light which came down over the car. And she thought it was the helicopter, because they have a blue light that blinks on the underside of it. And thinking that the helicopter might have a message for her, she got out of the car and had a look at it. And she was really quite staggered, because it was a huge object. It would have spanned the road, that's the macadam strip, plus the two side pieces on the road, which would have made it an extremely large saucer, which would be the object was possibly, in her estimation, but 2 telephone poles high, and would have spanned the strip of road, which was 24 feet wide, also taking in the nature strips on the either side of the road, and making the saucer approximately 100 feet in diameter. Now, having already alighted from the car, she leaned back and took a long look at the object and wondered what it was that she was seeing. The object's surface was smooth. It had no joins or welds, seams or rivets, no windows or portholes, and no wheels. The huge object was radiating a brilliant light, or blue light, and an intense glow, and there was no movement, no wobbling, no rotating, but a faint humming could be heard. And she noted all these things while wondering what sort of aircraft it was before fear took over, at which time she quickly got back into the car and drove off as fast as she could, only to find the object was maintaining its speed just above and behind the car. No matter how fast she travelled, the object seemed to remain at the same distance. Aware that the blue light was no longer with her, and seeing a very bright light streak off in the opposite direction, Mrs. Puddy realised that the chase must have been over. And it followed her for about 8 minutes, or 8 miles rather. She didn't go a mile a minute, but 8 miles. The witness reported her sighting to the police at Dramana, and some family members, and also some friends who considered it all a bit of a joke. So she decided to do a little bit more about it, but not until about 3 weeks later. Then on the 25th of July, and that same year, after having visited her son again, he was there in the hospital for some time, she followed a similar route home, had a cup of tea with her mother, and left again about the same time, 9:15. She arrived at the Mooraduc Road travelled a short distance of about 1 mile when the blue light once again appeared before her. And she thought, oh no, not again. And this time I'm not going to stop. And she was hanging onto the steering wheel and nothing was going to move her from that car. And the car drifted to a stop on the side of the road. No matter what she did to the Holden car, it wouldn't reply to her demands. And she was wondering, where do I go from here? She was rather terrified and gripped the wheel and looked out the windscreen and saw the object hanging silently in the, above the car, just in front of it and above the car. And the countryside was bathed in a blue light. Then a voice spoke to her. Not audibly, she said, but in her head, as if somebody, it was a thought put into the head. And as if words had been put into a computer and came out the other end in the most beautifully modulated and very well-spoken English. During this time, she experienced a most unusual sensation. She said if you could feel that you'd been in a vacuum, well, that was the impression that she got. It was perfectly still and perfectly quiet. And the message read, "Don't be afraid," as a pause. "We mean you no harm," another pause. "Your tests will be negative." And she'd already had some done and they were negative, but she thought they couldn't have been the ones. "Tell the media," and a longer pause, "and you are now in control." And at that moment the car started up again as if she had turned the key. Now, she didn't touch the key at all. She just sat there. She was stunned. So the car started up because she hadn't turned it off. They had, apparently. And she stopped at the same police station to find it closed. Then she went on to the next one, and still on her way home. And she told the police officer that, "I want to report a sighting of a flying saucer." "Oh, yes, madam, yes," came the reply. And she insisted in fear and frustration. So the policeman humoured her and had it recorded. The next morning she phoned Laverton RAAF station and asked if they could offer any explanation of what she'd seen, to which they replied that it couldn't have been an aircraft or a balloon, as neither would have been in the area at the time, but didn't say as it could cause panic, anything that could cause panic. They would send her a questionnaire to complete, but when asked about this later, she said, you'd have to have been an astronaut to have understood it, and I believe she didn't bother to return it. But Paul and I were invited to go through the Air Force files, and we discovered that she obviously had returned it at a later date. Must have thought much better of it. Naturally, we questioned Maureen regarding her experience in the car, and what did the messages mean? She said she'd not had any recent tests, but she'd had some about 6 months before, and they had proved negative. There was no use telling her not to be afraid because she was terrified. As for telling the media, she'd phoned 3 or 4 TV stations, and one was mildly interested, and they were showing Chariots of the Gods at the time, and 2 made light of the news, and she didn't bother to contact the 3rd one or the 4th one. And I heard through a radio talkback program, which in desperation she had contacted because the UFO nuts had said to contact the media, and she was not wanting to see them again. UFO naughts, I meant, not UFO nuts. We're the UFO nuts. And at this stage, I'd not actually met Maureen. That was the day I spoke to her on the telephone, and only spoken to her for 1 hour. But when I invited her to address one of our meetings, we had the National Mutual Theaterette at the time, a delightful little theaterette, and she agreed to do this, and we sat her down the front where she couldn't see all the people coming in, and I said, well, you'll be comfortable there and you won't see anybody. So when she got up to speak, she was staggered at the number of people that were filling the hall and outside into the lobby. But that hall was crowded, and it was very, very quiet, right through the whole hour of her talk. And even the people outside who were standing were perfectly quiet. Everybody was thoroughly fascinated. During the period, the question period that time, Maureen was put through her paces. She did think that what she saw was a psychic phenomena. And did she suffer any burns or after effects? To both these questions, the first one was, did she think it was a psychic phenomena? And to both the questions she answered no. Did she think there were any other witnesses? She thought there must have been one at least, because as she was approaching the railway crossing, she saw a man with a torch leading a car across the railroads, and surely the UFO must have passed it over him, but would have been going in the same direction, so he may not have seen it. Later the man's wife contacted her, and also another lady living on the ridge, the range ridge there, who'd seen a light coming across the road. Both had seen this. The third experience was purely a psychic experience, and this happened about 6 months later. It was one Wednesday evening. I'd received a phone call from a rather agitated Maureen, who said she'd been trying to contact 2 other representatives. Probably a good thing that she couldn't contact them, because she may have had to have gone public, and I don't think she really wanted that. She was quite happy to speak at our meeting, but not to go public in media or publications. For some days she'd been hearing a voice calling to her, Maureen, return to the meeting place. And it didn't matter where she went, she could hear this voice. She heard it at the front door, and she went to answer the door, and the husband said, who was that? Because the husband was in a wheelchair at this stage. He was an invalid and had been for some time. And she said there was nobody there. She went up shopping and turned around to hear somebody who'd been saying, Maureen, return to the meeting place. And this was getting on her nerves a bit. I think she was getting a little bit worried as she was going shopping that day. And she felt that she had to go to the meeting place and was too scared to go alone. So when she rang my number, I told Paul, and off we both trotted that night. We took our supper with us and went off in his car down to meet Maureen at the meeting place. We said we'd wait to see her at an electrical substation, which was right opposite where we were going to be. And she came along about 8:30 and rather agitatedly dashed over from her car to ours. And we were there, really quite early. It was still, I think, only just light. And she came over, rushing over and saying, I nearly went off the road back there. And I said, well, I suggest you tell us all about it when we drive to the meeting place. So she said that there was, before going further, I should perhaps add that as I entered her car to go away to the meeting place, I had an odd feeling when I touched the electrical experience, when I touched the door of her car, and I got a sort of an electric shock, which probably wouldn't have been unusual for me, because I thought maybe being somewhere near the substation, it might have had an effect on the car, and touching the metal handle might have had an effect of a slightly electric shock on myself. However, I got into the car, and I said, she'd told me that there was a little man sitting there when she'd turned around the corner up there, and I said, is he still there? And I thought, well, if he is, I'm sitting on him. And she said, no, he went when I got out of the car, when she got out of the car. And I said, what did he look like? And that she was really quite shocked at this. And he got out of the car. He was like a little man, she said, but in a tinsel type suit. He was silvery, and he was described as sitting exactly where I was, which was quite close to her in the middle of the seat, because I thought Paul was going to come in with us, and I'd moved in. But he wasn't there, and I couldn't visualise it. I had no idea. I mean, I might have a very good imagination at times, but it didn't run to that extent. And when we got back to the meeting place, which was a little drive off among some trees, Paul got into the back of her car, and I was sitting in the front with her still. And we were talking about the latest incident when she grabbed my arm and shook me, and she pointed across and she said, there he is, can't you see him? And can't you see him? And she's sitting there shaking me like Billy-O. And I tried to explain to her that it was possibly like closed circuit television from them to her. And she said he was coming closer to the car. In fact, he was so close that had I put my arm out, I could possibly touch him. And I was edging closer to her because she said that he wanted to get out of the car. And I said, well, come on, I'll come with you. And she wasn't going to get out anywhere. She was hanging onto that steering wheel. She wasn't going to move. So we asked Paul if he would get out of the car, brave Paul, and walk around the car to see what the entity would do. And he did. He was brave enough to do it. And I said to Maureen, what's the entity doing, Maureen? And she said, he's taken a step back to let Paul get between the car and himself. So, and she adamantly declared she still wasn't going to get out of it. So I tried, still trying to gently ease her out of the car. Anyway, the entity then became impatient and he started to walk away or move away and disappeared behind some thin bushes there. And she suddenly commenced describing the interior of the object. She said, oh, I'm inside the object. And I said, well, what's it like? And she told us that the entity had been standing there pointing to a large mushroom-like thing, like object in the centre of the circular room. It was a huge circular room, she said. Couldn't see any doors or windows or anything. The centre object, which was taller than an average person, was a bit like a jelly. She said the first part was a bit like a clock, you know, with the Roman numerals all the way around it. And there's another part of it, interior part, which seemed to be moving like a jelly. So I asked her if it was like a gyroscope. And she said, what's a gyroscope? Well, we'd asked her that later on, and she had no idea what a gyroscope was, so we went on with this. She said there were like Roman numerals. Apparently, looking around the room, she became very agitated, started to cry, and I put my arm around her shoulder. And she says, I can't get out, I can't get out. There are no doors or windows. I can't get out. And that was her great fear at the time. She was in this UFO and couldn't get out. She didn't realise she was still sitting there with me. And she was really upset, and I clearly visualised what she was telling us, as if there was a picture in front of us. I knew exactly what she was describing. She said the little man was standing there pointing to this object, and she was watching and didn't take her eyes off it. So I decided, because she was so upset and agitated, that I was getting a bit concerned about her, because I could feel her tears falling down onto my hand, which was around her shoulders. And I directed my thoughts to them, and I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. And I thought, well, you know, I'm fearful for her state of health. If you can help her, please do. And you got her into this state, so get her out of it. And I felt she might have had a nervous breakdown or a stroke or something. She was just so upset. And anyway, they said she said they wanted her to close her eyes. And I said, well, go ahead. And she said, no, I'm not going to close my eyes. And you know, when you blink, you have no idea of blinking because you do it so naturally. So she obviously blinked, and then I could feel her relax. And she must have gone out into a sort of a trance or a coma or whatever you like to call it. And then she began again to describe the interior of the object, and she still could see no way out, and she was still upset. And after a brief period, she sort of came back to us. She relaxed and she said, oh, I'm back again. And I said to Paul, well, let's have this cup of tea. We had a cup of tea with us, and we'll discuss it further and see what else we can make out of this, and see what she can get, see if Maureen can remember anything extra. So we put the lights on, and we got the thermos flask out and handed Maureen a cup of tea. And she's all of a sudden, even with a cup of tea in her hand, she said, oh, I'm back in there again. And she started describing it again and repeated the whole description all over again. And after a little while, she said more calmly, he's gone. And he's gone this time. I said, how do you know he's gone? She said, the feeling's different. It's gone completely. He's gone. It feels different. So now she came back to normal again. And everything seemed quite normal, so we went on with our supper and discussing the mushroom. And I was trying to identify it because she wasn't very technically minded. And I asked if it was like a gyroscope, but Maureen was apparently unfamiliar with that term. I'd only come into met the term because I was working with an airline, and they took us through all the area where they used to do up the aircraft and go over all these things. So I knew what it was. And she picked up a little gadget off the dashboard and said, "Would this be like it?" And to my astonishment, it was one of those tiny little compasses that people have stuck on their dashboard. And she said that was almost identical to the mushroom that she'd been viewing. And it sticks on this little one sticks on the dashboard, you know, with a suction cup. I hadn't seen one before, and I haven't seen one since. But we didn't let her drive home alone, and she didn't wish to go either on her own, because she was afraid that they might come back again. And she didn't want another visit from her friends, so-called, or the nerves on the part of the drive. She thought she might have had an accident or something. So I drove in her car, and Paul followed us, and we went further down the line, further away from home. And I believe at this time that it was about 10:30 or 11 o'clock when we got down to her home. We didn't really take that much notice of the time, but it was about that time. And of course the events went through the air again. Her husband was there, and we made a cup of tea and sat and discussed it again. And was I able to communicate with the entity when he said to close her eyes? Did I really communicate with them? Did they receive my thoughts regarding her agitated state? This is just our own thoughts after this. If so, what thoughts can they receive from more important and delicate situations than that particular one? Can they transmit to us? Can we transmit to them? I do believe that as science has gone on since those years, of course, naturally, we can communicate a lot more easily with in so many various ways. And I thought perhaps at this stage that, have you ever watched a hypnotist on a stage, you know, at work, when they get a whole lot of people there, and they can either, "I can't hypnotise you," or "Come on, I can hypnotise you," and they get up there and they put them under, as we say. And when I snap my fingers, you will go into a deeper trance, or you'll come out of it, or you'll do such and such a thing. Was this second or third case the time when they snapped their fingers at Maureen Puddy, and she went along and went into this so-called trance and visualised the inside of this object? Was the second meeting of such case in her car just prior to speaking to her, was that the time when they perhaps snapped their fingers then? That if you could be in a vacuum, then I've been in one, such an incident. There was no sound, there was no movement, all was calm and quiet. Then the voice delivered the message. Was the third incident due to the snapping of the fingers when they urged her to act? If this is so, how many people can they hypnotise? I'll put it that way. Perhaps in their sleep, so we react when they wish us to, or whenever they snap their fingers. I find this a very sobering thought. Perhaps some of the abductions are the result of this snapping of the fingers by them. Thank you for your attention.